Now, the climate policy wars that you know all too well have bedevilled not only Australian politics but, of course, the Liberal and National parties over the past decade or so continue to play out. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was on the US 60 Minutes program last night referring to Conservative Liberals who don't want to take further action on emissions reductions as dangerous idiots. What's your reaction to this contest continuing on within and outside the Parliament?
Chris, you won't be surprised that I don't want to buy into a fight with a respected former Prime Minister. I'm not in the business of fighting with members of that rather small club. So look, I'm not going to take issue with any particular set of words. I think all of us want to reduce emissions. All of us want to reduce emissions. The question is, how high a price are we prepared to pay? And my view always has been, and I think this is the sensible view of the Morrison government, that if the price is a big hit on people's cost of living, if the price is exporting our manufacturing industries overseas, well, that's a price too high. It's a goal too far.
I'll come back to that point, that policy from one of your speeches, but just still on Malcolm Turnbull. Both he and former Labor Prime Minister Kevin Rudd are speaking in very strident terms about Australia and Australia's role on climate policy. They're doing it to overseas media. Are they guilty, as former Prime Ministers, of denigrating their own country on the international stage?
Look, again, Chris, I'm not going to be critical of my fellow former Prime Ministers. I'm just not going to buy into a public fight with any of them on something like this. I think that former Prime Ministers are entitled to speak their mind, but I do make this point in respect of the broader issue that we shouldn't be in the business of gestures, particularly if the gesture might hurt our country without making any significant difference to the environment. And as you and others have been saying for a long, long time now, we could reduce our emissions to zero and make next to no difference to global emissions. It was no less a person than the chief scientist who said if Australia entirely eliminated our emissions, the difference that would make to global climate was, and I quote, virtually nothing, unquote.
Nonetheless, you signed up to the Paris Agreement when you were Prime Minister. It was later ratified under Malcolm Turnbull, and it's under the Paris Agreement that people are now suggesting we and the rest of the world can get to zero net emissions by 2050. Is that realistic?
Well, I agreed on a negotiating position to take to Paris. Paris was signed by my successor, but the advice I had at the time, Chris, was that we could reduce our emissions by 26% because of policies and trends that were already in place. It was precisely because the official advice at the time was that we could do this without imposing new costs on businesses, without imposing new taxes, without imposing new costs on taxpayers of any great significance, that we took that particular position to Paris.
All right, I'll go to this speech of yours from 2015, and I just wanted to highlight what you said then about climate policy. We will continue to deliver reduced emissions in ways that don't damage our economy, you said. We will continue to be a good environmental global citizen without taxing investment and jobs, which mirrors with what you just said there. But this is the quandary for governments, isn't it? Especially coalition governments. Do what you can to sort of fit in with a global effort, but you know in your rational heart that what we're doing produces no benefit whatsoever except that international gesture.
Look, if we can reduce our costs by minimising power use, all to the good. If we can reduce our costs by minimising fuel use, all to the good, and that's essentially what Australian businesses have been sensibly doing for the best part of a couple of decades, which is why not only have we reduced our emissions quite substantially in absolute terms, and we've done so much better than many countries that have been much more effusive on this, much more almost theological on this than we have been, but our emissions intensity has reduced by something like 50% over the last couple of decades. So when it comes to being a good global environmental citizen, we have an outstanding record, and frankly we deserve more credit on this than we usually get.